All interpretation is grounded in understanding. What is articulated as such an interpretation, and is prefigured as articulable in understanding in general, is meaning. Since the statement, the judgment, is based on understanding and represents a derivative form of interpretation, it also has a meaning. Meaning, however, cannot be defined as what occurs in a judgment along with the act of judgment. The explicit analysis of the statement has several goals in our context. On the one hand, we can demonstrate in the statement in what way the structure of the as, which is constitutive for understanding and interpretation, can be modified. Understanding and interpretation thus come into sharper focus. Moreover, the analysis of the statement has a distinctive place in the fundamental ontological problematic, because, in the decisive beginnings of ancient ontology, the V709 functioned as the sole guide for the access to beings as they really are and for the determination of the being of being. Finally, the statement has been regarded from ancient times as the primary and true locus of truth. This phenomenon is so intimately connected with the problem of being that our inquiry necessarily runs into the problem of truth as it proceeds. It already lies within the dimension of that problem, although not explicitly. The analysis of the statement is to make way for this problematic. In what follows, we shall assign to the term statement 3 significations, which are drawn from the phenomenon thus characterized. They are interconnected and delineate in their unity the full structure of the statement. 1. Primarily, statement means pointing out Aussage. This we adhere to the primordial meaning of tilde oios as aid yavam s, to let beings be seen from themselves. In the statement, the hammer is too heavy. What is discovered for sight is not a meaning, but a being in the mode of its being at hand. Even when this being is not near enough to be grasped and seen, pointing out designates the being itself, not a mere representation of it, neither something merely represented, nor even a psychical condition of the speaker, his representing of this being. 2. Statement is tantamount to predication. A predicate is stated about a subject, the latter is determined by the former. What is stated in this signification of statement is not the predicate, but the hammer itself. What does this stating, that is, the determining on the other hand, lies in the too heavy. What is stated in the second signification of statement, what is determined as such, has been narrowed down in its content as opposed to what is stated in the first signification of this term. Every predication is what it is only as a pointing out. The second signification of statement has its foundation in the first. The elements which are articulated in predication, subject-predicate, originate within the pointing out. Determining does not first discover, but as a mode of pointing out initially limits seeing precisely to what shows itself hammer as such, in order to manifest explicitly what is manifest in its determinacy through the explicit limitation of looking. When confronted with what is already manifest, with a hammer which is too heavy, determining must first take a step back. Positing the subject dims beings down to focus on the hammer there, in order to let what is manifest be seen in its determinable definite character through this dimming down. Positing the subject, positing the predicate, and positing them together are thoroughly epiphantic, in the strict sense of the word. 3. Statement means communication mitalang, speaking forth. As such, it has a direct relation to statement in the first and second meaning. It is letting someone see with us what has been pointed out in its definite character. Letting someone see with us shares with others the being pointed out in its definite. What is shared is the being toward saying that which has been pointed out. It is a way of seeing something as in common. We must keep in mind that this being toward is being in the world, namely, in the world from which what is pointed out is encountered. Any statement, as a communication understood existentially, must have been expressed. As something communicated, what is spoken can be shared by others with the speaker even when they themselves do not have the beings pointed out and defined within reach or within sight. What is spoken can be passed along in further retelling. The orbit of communication which sees expands itself. But at the same time, what is pointed out can become veiled again in this further retelling, although the knowledge and cognition growing in such hearsay always refers to beings themselves and does not affirm a valid meaning passed around. Even hearsay is a being in the world and a being toward what is heard. The theory of judgment, prevalent today that is oriented toward the phenomenon of validity, shall not be discussed at any length here. It is sufficient to refer to the very questionable character of this phenomenon of validity, which, ever since Lotze, people have been fond of passing off as a primal phenomenon, not to be traced further back. It owes this role only to its ontological lack of clarity. Problematic, which has entrenched itself around this idolatry of the word, is just as opaque. First, validity means the form of the reality, which belongs to the content of the judgment insofar as it is unchangeable as opposed to the changeable psychic act of judgment. In light of the position of the question of being in general characterized in the introduction to this inquiry, we can hardly expect that validity, as ideal being, is going to be distinguished by any special ontological clarity. Second, validity means the validity of the meaning of the judgment which is valid for the object it has in view, and thus receives the significance of objective validity and objectivity in general. The meaning thus valid for beings, and which is valid timelessly in itself, is said to be valid also in the sense of being valid for every person who judges rationally. Third, validity means bindingness, universal validity, if one then advocates a critical epistemology, according to which the subject does not truly come out to the object, then this valid character, as the validity of an object, objectivity, is based on the valid content of true meaning. The three meanings of validity set forth, the way of being of the ideal, as objectivity and as bindingness, are not only in themselves opaque, but constantly get confused with one another. Methodological caution requires that we do not choose such unstable concepts as the guide for our interpretation. We do not restrict the concept of meaning in advance to the signification of a content of judgment, but we understand it as the existential phenomenon characterized in which the formal framework of what can be disclosed in understanding and articulated in interpretation becomes visible as such. When we collect the three meanings of statement, analyzed here in a unitary view of the complete phenomenon, the definition reads, statement is a pointing out which communicates and defines. Now we must ask, what right do we have at all to conceive the statement as a mode of interpretation? If it is something of this sort, the essential structures of interpretation must be repeated in it. The statement's pointing out is accomplished on the basis of what is already disclosed in understanding, or what is circumspectly discovered. The statement is not an unattached kind of behavior which could of itself primarily disclose beings in general, but always already maintains itself on the basis of being in the world. What we showed earlier 9, with regard to knowing the world, is just as true of the statement. It needs a forehaving of something disclosed in general, which it points out in the mode of determining. Furthermore, when one begins to determine something, one has a directed viewpoint with respect to what is to be stated. In the act of determining something bestimmungsweise, the function of determining is taken over by that with regard to which beings that have been presented are envisaged. Thus, the statement needs a foresight in which the predicate that is to be delineated and attributed is itself loosened, so to speak, from its implicit enclosure in the being itself. The significant articulation of what is pointed out always belongs to the statement as communication that defines. It operates within a definite set of concepts. The hammer is heavy. Heaviness belongs to the hammer. The hammer has the property of heaviness. The foreconception always also contained, and the statement remains mostly inconspicuous, because language always already contains a developed conceptuality. Like interpretation in general, the statement necessarily has its existential foundations in forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. But how does the statement become a derivative mode of interpretation? What has been modified in it? We can point out the modification by sticking with limiting cases of statements which function in logic as normal cases, and as examples of the simplest phenomena of statement. That which logic makes thematic with the categorical statement, for example, the hammer is heavy, it is always already understood logically before any analysis. As the meaning of the sentence, it has already presupposed, without noticing, the following: this thing, the hammer, has the property of heaviness. Initially, there are no such statements in heedful circumspection. But it does have its specific ways of interpretation which can read as follows as compared with the theoretical judgment just mentioned, and may take some such form as the hammer is too heavy, or even better, too heavy, the other hammer. The primordial act of interpretation does not lie in a theoretical sentence, but in circumspectly and heedfully putting away or changing the inappropriate tool without wasting words. From the fact that words are absent, we may not conclude that the interpretation is absent. On the other hand, the circumspectly spoken interpretation is not already necessarily a statement in the sense defined. Through what existential ontological modifications does the statement originate from circumspect interpretation? Being held in forehaving, for example, the hammer, is initially at hand as a useful thing. If this being is the object of a statement, As soon as we begin the statement, a transformation in the forehaving is already brought about beforehand. Something at hand with which we have to do or perform something turns into something about which the statement that points it out is made. Foresight aims at something objectively present in what is at hand. Both by and for the way of looking, what is at hand is veiled as something at hand. Within this discovering of objective presence which covers overhandiness, what is encountered as objectively present is determined in its being objectively present in such and such a way. Now the access is first available for something like quality. That as which the statement determines what is objectively present is drawn from what is objectively present as such. The as structure of interpretation has undergone a modification. The as no longer reaches out into a totality of relevance in its function of approaching what is understood. It is cut off with regard to its possibilities of the articulation of referential relations of significance, which constitute the character of the surrounding world. The as gets pushed back to the uniform level of what is merely objectively present. It dwindles to the determination that belongs to the structure of just letting what is objectively present be seen. This leveling down of the primordial, as of circumspect interpretation to the as of the determination of objective presence, is the specialty of the statement. Only in this way does it gain the possibility of pointing something out in a way that we merely look at it. Thus the statement cannot deny its ontological provenance from an interpretation that understands. We call primordial the as of circumspect interpretation that understands, EP micro RLVCF, of the existential hermeneutical, as in distinction from the epiphantical as of the statement. There are many interim stages between an interpretation which is completely wrapped up in heedful understanding, and the extreme opposite case of a theoretical statement about objectively present things, statements about events in the surrounding world, descriptions of what is at hand, reports on situations, noting and ascertaining a factual situation, describing a state of affairs, telling about what has happened. These sentences cannot be reduced to theoretical propositional statements without essentially distorting their meaning. Like the latter, they have their origin in circumspect interpretation. With the progress of knowledge about the structure of the zoyog, it was inevitable that this phenomenon of the epiphantical as came to view in some form. The way in which it was initially seen is not a matter of chance, nor did it fail to have its influence on the history of logic to come. When considered philosophically, the OOS is itself a being sciens, and in accordance with the orientation of ancient ontology, something present. What is initially present, that is, what can be found like things, are words and the succession of words in which the is spoken. When we first seek for the structure of the logos thus present, we find a being present together zusum en vorhanden scene of several words. What constitutes the unity of this together? As Plato knew, it consists in the fact that the V709 is always titva. With regard to the beings manifest into the words, are combined to form one totality of words. Aristotle had a more radical view. Every is 61J vi 6NG and 6 UXP 6NS at the same time, neither the one say, as a positive judgment, nor the other as a negative judgment. Rather, every statement, whether affirmative or negative, whether false or true, is equiprimordially 61J Vic 6NG and in CDPC 6NG. Pointing out is putting together and taking apart. However, Aristotle did not pursue this analytical question further to the problem. What phenomenon is it then within the structure of the AEOS that allows and requires us to characterize every statement as synthesis and diarchy? What is to be got at phenomenally with the formal structures of binding and separating, more precisely, with the unity of the two is the phenomenon of something as something. In accordance with this structure, something is understood with regard to something else. It is taken together with it, so that this confrontation that understands, interprets, and articulates at the same time takes apart what has been put together. If the phenomenon of the as is covered over, and above all, veiled in its existential origin from the hermeneutical as, then Aristotle's phenomenological point of departure disintegrates into the analysis of V709 in a superficial theory of judgment, according to which judgment is a binding or separating of representations and concepts. Binding and separating can be further formalized to mean a relating. The judgment is dissolved logistically into a system of coordinations. It becomes the object of calculation, but not a theme of ontological interpretation. The possibility and impossibility of the analytical understanding of 61J Vic 6NG and an CXF PCRNG, or relation, in the judgment in general, is closely bound up with the actual state of the fundamental ontological problematic. To what extent this problematic has an effect on the interpretation of the, and on the other hand, to what extent the concept of judgment has, by a remarkable counter-movement, an effect on the ontological problematic, is shown by the phenomenon of the copula. It becomes evident in this bond that the structure of synthesis is initially posited as a matter of course, and that it has also maintained the decisive interpretative function. But if the formal characteristics of relation and binding cannot contribute anything phenomenally to the factual structural analysis of the phenomenon intended with the term, copula, finally has nothing to do with bond and binding. Whether expressed explicitly in language or indicated in the verbal ending, the is and its interpretation are moved into the context of problems of the existential analytic, if statements and an understanding of being are existential possibilities of being of Dasein itself. The development of the question of being cf. Division 1, Section 3, will then encounter again this peculiar phenomenon of being within the for the time being. We wanted to clarify with this demonstration of the derivation of the statement from interpretation, and understanding the fact that the logic of zoolog is rooted in the existential analytic, of recognizing the ontologically insufficient interpretation of the, at the same time, sharpens our insight into the lack of primordiality of the methodical basis on which ancient ontology developed. It is experienced as something objectively present and interpreted as such, and the beings which it points out have the meaning of objective presence as well. This meaning of being itself is left undifferentiated and uncontrasted with other possibilities of being, so that being sane in the sense of a formal being something et was sane is at the same time fused with it, and we are unable to obtain a clear-cut division between these two realms.